Grace Kelly, Her Royal Grace, a shining star in Dean Martin's Hollywood era, the golden age of cinema. The year was 1954, and Hollywood was experiencing a renaissance of elegance and sophistication that would define an entire generation. The studios were producing films of unprecedented scale and ambition, and the stars who graced the silver screen were treated with a reverence typically reserved for royalty. Among these luminaries stood Grace Kelly, a woman whose beauty, talent, and grace seemed almost too perfect to be real. Yet there she was, walking through the corridors of MGM Studios, her posture impeccable, her presence commanding attention without demanding it. Grace Patricia Kelly had arrived in Hollywood just 3 years earlier, in 1951, with a background that set her apart from most of her contemporaries. Born into a wealthy and prominent Philadelphia family, she had been raised with all the advantages that money and social standing could provide. Her father, Jack Kelly, was a self-made millionaire and an Olympic champion rower. Her mother, Margaret, came from a distinguished Irish-American family. Grace had been educated at the finest schools, trained in the arts, and groomed from childhood to be a woman of refinement and culture. But Grace possessed something that money and breeding alone could not provide: an extraordinary talent for acting. She had studied drama at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York, and she had honed her craft through years of work in theater and television before making the leap to motion pictures. When she arrived in Hollywood, the studio executives recognized immediately that they had discovered something rare: a woman who combined classical beauty with genuine dramatic ability, who could convey complex emotions with a single glance, and who possessed an innate elegance that could not be manufactured or taught. Her early films had been modest successes, but it was her role in Dial M for Murder, directed by the master of suspense Alfred Hitchcock, that had truly launched her career. Hitchcock had been immediately captivated by her, recognizing in her a quality that transcended mere physical beauty. He saw in Grace a kind of cool, controlled elegance that could convey both vulnerability and strength, innocence and sophistication. He cast her in Rear Window, opposite James Stewart, and the film had become a critical and commercial triumph. By 1954, Grace Kelly was one of the most sought-after actresses in Hollywood. She had appeared in Magambo with Clark Gable and Ava Gardner, and she was in the midst of filming The Country Girl with Bing Crosby, a role that would showcase her dramatic range and ultimately earn her an Academy Award nomination. Yet despite her professional success, Grace remained somewhat of an enigma in Hollywood society. She was polite and gracious to everyone she met, but she maintained a certain distance, a reserve that kept people from getting too close. This reserve was not coldness or arrogance, but rather a reflection of her upbringing and her values. Grace had been raised to believe that a woman of her station should maintain certain standards of propriety and decorum. She was not interested in the kind of publicity-seeking behavior that characterized many of her contemporaries. She did not court the gossip columnists or seek out the most exclusive parties. Instead, she focused on her work, on developing her craft, and on maintaining the kind of dignified presence that had been instilled in her from childhood. It was at a charity gala in the spring of 1954 that Grace Kelly first encountered Dean Martin in a meaningful way. The event was being held at the Beverly Hills Hotel, and it was one of the most prestigious social occasions of the season. Grace had been invited as a guest of honor, and she arrived wearing a stunning gown of pale blue silk that had been designed specifically for her by one of the finest couturiers in Paris. The gown was a masterpiece of understated elegance, simple in its lines, but exquisite in its execution, with delicate beading that caught the light as she moved. Dean Martin was there as well, performing for the assembled guests. He had recently completed his professional partnership with Jerry Lewis, and he was in the process of establishing himself as a solo artist and actor. He was charming, talented, and possessed of a kind of effortless magnetism that drew people to him. As he performed that evening, singing several of his most popular songs, Grace found herself watching him with genuine appreciation for his talent and his stage presence. Subscribe to our channel now to explore more fascinating stories about the golden age of Hollywood and the legendary stars who defined an era. Don't miss a single episode. Click subscribe today. After his performance, Dean made his way through the crowd, greeting various guests and accepting their congratulations. When he spotted Grace standing near the edge of the ballroom, he felt an immediate and almost involuntary attraction. She was, without question, the most beautiful woman in the room, but it was not merely her physical beauty that captivated him. It was the way she carried herself, the quiet confidence in her bearing, the intelligence that shone in her eyes. He approached her with his characteristic charm, introducing himself with a warm smile. Grace, who had been trained since childhood in the art of gracious social interaction, responded with polite interest. They spoke for several minutes about the event, about the various guests, about the state of the entertainment industry. Dean found himself genuinely engaged in the conversation, impressed by Grace's intelligence and her ability to discuss complex topics with insight and nuance. As the evening progressed, Dean found himself returning to Grace's side several times, drawn back by something he couldn't quite define. There was a quality about her that intrigued him, a sense that there was far more to her than what appeared on the surface. She was not the kind of woman who would be easily impressed by his fame or his charm, and somehow, that made her all the more fascinating to him. Over the following weeks, Dean and Grace began to encounter each other with increasing frequency in Hollywood's social circles. They would see each other at industry events, at dinner parties hosted by mutual friends, at premieres and galas. Each time they met, they would engage in conversation, and each time, Dean found himself more intrigued by this elegant, intelligent woman who seemed to exist slightly apart from the usual Hollywood scene. Grace, for her part, found Dean to be surprisingly thoughtful and articulate. While his public persona was that of a charming entertainer and ladies' man, the man she encountered in private conversation was more complex and nuanced. He had opinions about art and literature, he was interested in current events and politics, and he possessed a dry sense of humor that appealed to her sensibilities. One evening, at a dinner party hosted by a prominent film producer, Dean found himself seated next to Grace. The dinner was an elegant affair, with fine wines and exquisite cuisine, and the conversation around the table ranged across a variety of topics. At one point, the discussion turned to the nature of acting and the challenges of portraying complex characters on screen. "I think the key," Grace said thoughtfully, "is to find the truth in the character, to understand their motivations and their fears, and then to bring that understanding to the performance. It's not about pretending to be someone else. It's about finding the part of yourself that resonates with the character and allowing that to inform your portrayal." Dean listened intently, and when she finished speaking, he leaned toward her slightly. "That's a remarkably sophisticated approach to the craft," he said. "Most actors I know talk about acting in terms of technique and mechanics. But what you're describing is something much deeper. It's about emotional truth." "Exactly," Grace replied, and there was a spark of recognition in her eyes, a sense that she had found someone who understood what she was trying to articulate. "The technique is important, of course, but without the emotional foundation, it's just empty performance." After dinner, Dean suggested that they take a walk in the garden. Grace hesitated for only a moment before agreeing. They strolled through the moonlit garden, discussing their craft, their ambitions, and their observations about the entertainment industry. Dean found himself opening up to Grace in ways that he rarely did with anyone. He spoke about his childhood, about his early struggles in the entertainment business, about his dreams and his fears. Grace, in turn, shared her own perspective on fame and success. She spoke about the pressure to maintain a certain image, about the difficulty of being taken seriously as an actress when so much emphasis was placed on physical appearance, about her desire to do meaningful work that would challenge her as an artist. "I sometimes feel," she confessed, "that people see me as a beautiful object rather than as a person with thoughts and feelings and ambitions. They assume that because I come from a wealthy family, and because I'm considered attractive, my life must be easy and uncomplicated. But the truth is far more complex." Dean reached out and gently took her hand. "I see you," he said simply. "I see the intelligence, the talent, the depth, and I think you're going to do extraordinary things in this industry." If you're enjoying this story about Grace Kelly and Dean Martin, please like this video. Your support means everything to us and helps us continue creating content about Hollywood's greatest legends. Grace looked at him, and for a moment, there was a vulnerability in her expression that she rarely allowed anyone to see. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means more to me than you know." As they continued their walk, They talked about everything from philosophy to politics, from literature to music. By the time they returned to the house, both of them felt as though they had made a genuine connection with another person, not just a superficial social interaction, but a real meeting of minds and spirits. Over the following months, Dean and Grace began to spend more time together. They would attend events together, but they would also arrange private meetings, quiet dinners at out-of-the-way restaurants, drives through the Hollywood Hills, afternoons spent at the beach away from the prying eyes of the press and the Hollywood social scene. During these private moments, they were able to be themselves in a way that was not possible in public. Grace allowed her carefully maintained composure to relax slightly, revealing a sense of humor and a playfulness that few people ever saw. Dean, in turn, showed Grace a more serious and thoughtful side of himself, discussing his ambitions as an actor and his desire to be taken seriously as an artist rather than merely as an entertainer. Their relationship deepened, and both of them began to realize that what they had found in each other was something rare and precious. It was not the kind of passionate, all-consuming romance that was often celebrated in Hollywood films. Rather, it was a relationship built on genuine affection, intellectual compatibility, and mutual respect. They understood each other in a way that transcended the usual social dynamics of Hollywood. As Grace and Dean's relationship became more serious, they began to face increasing pressure from various quarters. The Hollywood gossip columnists, always hungry for juicy stories, began to speculate about the nature of their relationship. Some suggested that they were merely friends, while others hinted at a more romantic involvement. The speculation was not malicious, but it was persistent and invasive. More significantly, both Grace and Dean began to face pressure from their respective studios and from the people around them who had opinions about whom they should be dating. Grace's family, in particular, was concerned about her relationship with Dean. While they had nothing against him personally, they worried about the implications of their daughter being romantically linked to a man who, while talented and successful, did not come from the same social background as she did. Grace's mother, in particular, expressed her concerns during a phone call from Philadelphia. "Darling," she said, her voice carrying a note of gentle reproach, "I'm sure Mr. Martin is a perfectly nice man, but you must think about your reputation and your future. A woman in your position has certain responsibilities, certain expectations to uphold." Grace felt the weight of her family's expectations pressing down on her. She had always been the dutiful daughter, the one who maintained the family's standards and upheld their values. The idea of disappointing them, of doing something that might be seen as improper or beneath her station, was deeply troubling to her. At the same time, Dean was facing his own set of pressures. The studio executives who managed his career were concerned that his relationship with Grace might complicate his image. They worried that being associated with a woman from such a prominent and conservative family might limit his appeal to certain audiences. They suggested, not so subtly, that he might want to reconsider the relationship. One evening, after a particularly difficult day of filming, Dean arrived at Grace's apartment looking troubled. Grace could see immediately that something was wrong, and she led him to the sofa, where they sat down together. "What's happened?" she asked gently, taking his hand. "The studio," Dean said, his voice heavy with frustration. "They've made it clear that they don't approve of our relationship. They think it's bad for my image, that it's limiting my appeal. They've suggested that I should be seen dating other actresses, women who are more, I don't know, more in line with the kind of image they want to project." Grace felt her heart sink. She had known that this moment might come, but she had hoped to avoid it. "What did you tell them?" she asked. "I told them it was none of their business," Dean replied. "But the truth is, they have a lot of power over my career. If I go against their wishes, there could be consequences." Grace was quiet for a long moment. She understood the pressures that Dean was facing, because she was facing similar pressures herself. The studio system in Hollywood was all-powerful, and the executives who ran the studios had enormous influence over the careers of the actors under contract to them. To defy them was to risk one's entire career. "I don't want to be the reason your career suffers," Grace said finally. "I couldn't live with that. And I don't want to give you up," Dean replied. "But I also don't know how we can continue this relationship if we're going to face this kind of opposition from every direction." They sat together in silence, both of them grappling with the impossible situation they found themselves in. They loved each other, or at least, they cared deeply for each other, but the world around them seemed determined to keep them apart. What would you do in Grace and Dean's situation? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts about how they should handle the pressure from their families and studios. Over the following weeks, the situation became increasingly complicated. The gossip columnists continued to speculate about Grace and Dean's relationship, and the speculation began to take on a more negative tone. Some columnists suggested that Grace was being foolish to associate with Dean, that she was throwing away her chances of making a truly advantageous match. Others hinted that Dean was using Grace to elevate his own status in Hollywood society. Grace found herself becoming increasingly isolated. Some of her friends, concerned about the impact that her relationship with Dean might have on their own social standing, began to distance themselves from her. She received fewer invitations to the most exclusive parties and events. It was a subtle form of social ostracism, but it was effective nonetheless. Dean, meanwhile, was being pressured by the studio to be seen with other women. They arranged for him to be photographed with various actresses at public events, creating the impression that he was dating multiple women. It was a calculated strategy designed to undermine his relationship with Grace and to make him seem like the kind of man who was not capable of a serious, committed relationship. The strain began to take its toll on both of them. Grace became withdrawn and melancholic, her usual composure masking a deep sadness. Dean became increasingly frustrated and angry at the injustice of the situation. They continued to see each other, but their meetings became fraught with tension and uncertainty. One evening, after attending a premiere together, one of the few public appearances they had made as a couple, they returned to Grace's apartment to find photographers waiting outside. The photographers shouted questions at them, asking about the nature of their relationship, about their plans for the future, about whether they were planning to get married. Grace was shaken by the aggressive intrusion into their privacy. She had been raised to believe that a woman of her station should maintain a certain dignity and composure in public, but the photographer's behavior felt like a violation of that dignity. She felt exposed and vulnerable in a way that was deeply uncomfortable for her. Dean, seeing her distress, felt a surge of protective anger. He wanted to shield her from this kind of treatment, but he also knew that there was very little he could do to protect her from the relentless machinery of Hollywood publicity. As the summer of 1954 progressed, Grace found herself at a crossroads. She had been offered a role in a new film that was being produced by a prestigious director, and the role was one that she had been dreaming of playing. It was a complex, challenging part that would allow her to showcase her full range as an actress. However, accepting the role would require her to commit to a grueling filming schedule that would take her away from Los Angeles for several months. At the same time, her family was pressuring her to end her relationship with Dean. Her father, in particular, had made it clear that he disapproved of the relationship and that he believed it was damaging to the family's reputation. He suggested that if Grace wanted to maintain her standing in Philadelphia society and in her family, she would need to distance herself from Dean. Grace found herself torn between her love for Dean and her sense of duty to her family. She had always been the dutiful daughter, the one who upheld the family's values and maintained their standing in society. The idea of disappointing her father, of going against his wishes, was deeply troubling to her. One evening, she sat down with Dean and explained the situation to him. She told him about the film role, about the filming schedule, about the pressure from her family. She told him that she didn't know what to do, that she felt as though she was being forced to choose between her career, her family, and her relationship with him. Dean listened carefully, and when she had finished speaking, he took her hands in his. "Grace," he said gently, "I love you. But I also know that you're an artist, and that your work is incredibly important to you. I can't ask you to give that up for me. And I can't ask you to defy your family for me either. That's not fair to you. But what about us?" Grace asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What happens to us?" "I don't know," Dean admitted. "But I know that if you give up your dreams or your family for me, you'll eventually resent me for it. And I couldn't bear that." Grace felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. She knew that Dean was right, but that didn't make the situation any less painful. She had hoped that somehow they would be able to find a way to make their relationship work, but it was becoming increasingly clear that the obstacles they faced were simply too great. Over the following days, Grace made her decision. She would accept the film role. She would commit to the filming schedule, which would take her away from Los Angeles for 6 months. And she would, at least for now, stepped back from her relationship with Dean. When she told Dean about her decision, he was supportive, even though she could see the pain in his eyes. "You're making the right choice," he said. "This is your chance to do the kind of work that you've always wanted to do. You have to take it." "I'm going to miss you," Grace said softly. "I'm going to miss you too," Dean replied. "But we'll stay in touch. And when you come back, we can figure out what comes next." But both of them knew, even as they said these words, that things would likely be different when Grace returned. Time and distance had a way of changing relationships, of allowing people to move on and to find new paths in their lives. Subscribe to our channel to see how Grace Kelly's story continues. We're bringing you more incredible tales from Hollywood's golden age. Subscribe now and never miss an update. The film that Grace made during those 6 months away from Los Angeles was a critical and commercial success. Her performance was hailed by critics as one of the finest of her career, and it solidified her status as one of the most talented actresses of her generation. When she returned to Hollywood, she was greeted as a triumphant artist, and her career reached new heights. However, her personal life had undergone significant changes during her absence. Dean had, as the studio had suggested, been seen dating other women. While these relationships were largely manufactured for publicity purposes, they had served their intended effect of creating distance between him and Grace. When they encountered each other at industry events, they were cordial but distant, the easy intimacy they had once shared replaced by a kind of polite formality. Grace, for her part, had begun to receive attention from other men. There was a prince from a small European country who had expressed interest in her, and there were various wealthy businessmen and prominent figures who sought her company. Her family, pleased that she had ended her relationship with Dean, began to encourage her to pursue these more socially advantageous connections. In the years that followed, Grace's life took a trajectory that neither she nor Dean could have predicted. She continued to make films, and her career reached its zenith with her performances in Rear Window and To Catch a Thief. But in 1956, her life took a dramatic turn when she met Prince Rainier III of Monaco at the Cannes Film Festival. The meeting was arranged by the festival organizers as a publicity opportunity, but it quickly became something more. Prince Rainier was captivated by Grace, and she, in turn, found herself drawn to him. Within months, they were engaged, and by April 1956, Grace had married the prince and become the Princess of Monaco. The news of Grace's engagement and subsequent marriage sent shockwaves through Hollywood. The woman who had been one of the most promising actresses of her generation was giving up her career to become a princess. Some saw it as a fairy tale come true, while others saw it as a tragic waste of her talent. Dean, when he heard the news, felt a complex mixture of emotions. He was genuinely happy for Grace. He knew that she had always valued family and tradition, and that becoming a princess would allow her to fulfill a kind of destiny that had always been part of her. But he also felt a sense of loss, a recognition that the connection they had once shared was now truly in the past. Years later, when Dean was asked about his relationship with Grace Kelly, he would speak of her with genuine affection and respect. "She was a remarkable woman," he would say. "Talented, intelligent, gracious. I was honored to know her, and I was proud to see her achieve everything she set out to achieve." Grace, for her part, never spoke publicly about her relationship with Dean, maintaining the discretion and propriety that had always characterized her. But those who knew her well said that she had never forgotten him, that she had always regarded him with fondness and respect. What did you think of Grace Kelly's incredible journey? Leave a comment below and tell us your favorite moment from her story. We'd love to hear your thoughts about this Hollywood legend. The story of Grace Kelly and Dean Martin became one of the great what-if narratives of Hollywood history. What if Grace had chosen to pursue her relationship with Dean instead of her career? What if she had not met Prince Rainier? What if the pressures of Hollywood society had not forced them apart? But perhaps the real story is not about what might have been, but rather about what actually was. Grace and Dean had shared a genuine connection, a meeting of minds and spirits that had enriched both of their lives. They had understood each other in a way that transcended the usual social dynamics of Hollywood, and they had brought out the best in each other during the time they spent together. Grace went on to become a princess, and she used her position to become a patron of the arts and a humanitarian. She raised a family, and she became a beloved figure in Monaco and around the world. She never returned to acting, but she never regretted the choice she had made. She had found a different kind of fulfillment, a different kind of destiny. Dean, meanwhile, continued his career in Hollywood, becoming one of the most successful entertainers of his generation. He made numerous films, recorded countless albums, and became a beloved figure in American popular culture. While he had other relationships and eventually married, those who knew him well said that he never quite forgot the elegant, intelligent woman who had captivated him during those magical months in 1954. The legacy of their connection lived on in the memories of those who had known them, in the stories that were told and retold about their time together. It was a reminder that sometimes, the most meaningful connections in our lives are not the ones that last forever, but rather the ones that teach us something profound about ourselves and about what we're capable of feeling. Grace Kelly's story is ultimately a story about grace, not just the Grace that was her name, but the grace with which she navigated the complexities of her life. She faced impossible choices with dignity and composure. She pursued her dreams while honoring her family's values. She loved deeply, even when that love could not be sustained. And she went on to live a life of extraordinary significance and meaning. In the end, Grace Kelly's time in Hollywood's golden age, her connection with Dean Martin, and her subsequent transformation into a princess all became part of a larger narrative about the power of human connection, the importance of pursuing one's dreams, and the grace with which we can navigate the challenges and opportunities that life presents to us. The golden age of Hollywood produced many stars, but few of them possessed the combination of talent, beauty, intelligence, and grace that characterized Grace Kelly. And while her time in Hollywood was relatively brief, the impact she made during those years was profound and lasting. She remains, to this day, one of the most iconic figures of that era, a shining star whose light continues to inspire and captivate audiences around the world.